So anyway, there was something that I wanted to do today. Don't do these very often, but I did want to do this. There's a 30-minute video. Asmongold reacting to TheLazyPeon videos. Matt said, you're reacting to a guy reacting to another guy? Yeah. Reacception. If and when the kind of Eye of Sauron finds its way to the game that we're working on, the reaction will be very funny.
When will MMORPGs become popular again? Never? No, they will be. I guarantee you they will be. Nobody has correctly created the formula that makes an MMORPG something more than a game right now. I think that there are not tools that exist right now to create an immersive experience that is transformative enough to make MMORPGs have the same impact that they had back in the early 2000s.
So this is a point that comes up a couple of times, and essentially my takeaway from it is that there's a desire to have our lives changed as much as they were changed the first time we played our first MMOs, which was like, holy shit, this is a big virtual world, and we get very immersed in the experience of being in that world based primarily off the fact that we'd never seen anything like it before. So it was inherently more immersive. And so in an effort to get that same level of immersion and wonder and that sense of being transported to a different world, we need a new technology. And I find it interesting because I can see where that still relates to MMOs as in, well, when we have an MMO that is VR based or whatever, and I'm assuming it's some variation of VR, even if by VR we mean it's direct brain computer interface and it's essentially you're not moving at all and you're essentially in the matrix. I get that, but then I feel like what winds up happening then is we're judging all current MMOs based off this ideal of what's essentially a true virtual world in the future. And so when those things get conflated, I find it kind of sets the bar a little bit high for MMOs that are just trying to be MMOs nowadays. So anyways, but I say it now because I think you'll see that as a theme a couple times in the video, especially again towards the end.
It is just simply not transformative enough. Let's watch the video. I'm very curious to hear what TheLazyPeon's take on this is.
Do you miss the glory days of MMORPGs? Back when you were dropped in what felt like a completely unexplored world with infinite possibilities. Cosmetics from a cash shop and transmog wasn't a thing back then, remember? Every game felt like a new adventure.
If something's got Asmon reacting, it's kind of a 2-for-1 because I am very interested in his opinions on things. Like, for no matter what some of you may think about the way he communicates them or whatever, as somebody that's been working in games for, a while, to me, it's really interesting to see the level of understanding that content creators have of both the industry, player motivations, game design, business, basically the business decisions that are driving a lot of this. A lot of the perspective and a lot of what I hear from various content creators is pretty on the money, but then there are those times where it's just like, it's just off, Yeah. And so, and Goblin responded, gameplay for a gamer, not gameplay for the average. I want to exist in another world sort of thing. I think that's a good way to articulate it. The focus has become more and more in making a game and not making a place that happens to have gameplay as a primary motivator for being in the place. So
I think the most thing is the social interaction. I actually think that's the real reason why MMORPGs were successful, and I think it's the real reason why MMORPGs aren't as successful now. Because social media has taken the role that MMORPGs filled for a lot of people.
I agree with him all the way up until the point where it says social media has taken a place. For the people that social media has taken the place or taken the place of the role that MMOs used to fill, sure. But I still believe there's a decent segment of people that want to have that social experience, have that sense of place, enjoy some of the constraints and style of the game design of the previous era. That is a smaller segment. That's a smaller segment, but still, it's not everybody. But it was just interesting hearing Peon talk about old school MMOs and describe a lot of what we tend to talk about here. Twitter's a kind of MMO, Matt said. Instead of slaying dragons, you get to shitpost to celebs and politicians. Well, yeah, I could see that. There's even a progression system, right? How many followers do you have? It's a fair point.
The release of World of Warcraft in 2004 elevated this time period significantly though. These years, starting from Ultima Online, EverQuest, RuneScape to WoW, and so many more that I can't list, created a highly competitive and, most importantly, incredibly motivated market.
Back in the day, MMORPG was like the battle royale of gaming. Everybody wanted to have the big new MMORPG. It's actually crazy to think about, but it was pretty much the exact same.
This is 1,000% true. Yeah. It was funny. We, a handful of us that were on the EQ team got called up, basically asked if we wanted to go up to EA in LA for the day and talk to them. So we were like, yeah, sure, we'll do that. What's the harm in talking? And so we went up there, and it was funny because they just had us go around in like separate groups to each of the producers of all the stuff they were making. And there was these questions that were just like, if you could turn game X into an MMO, how would you do it? Right? Like they basically just wanted to turn every game into an MMO. It was pretty crazy.
Metin 2 to World of Warcraft and Guild Wars 1. In 2021, we saw Elion and New World release.
Yeah, everybody
Elion
wanted to make an
died
MMO
pretty
back
much
then.
instantly, and New World has had its fair share of struggles, to say the least. In 2022, we've only really had Lost Ark. I kind of feel like...
For me, I feel like in the last year or so, I've had really no problem trying to find content.
MMOs peaked around WoW's Wrath of the Lich King expansion. In today's gaming market, if we had a new MMO phenomenon as big as WoW was at its peak, surely that player count would be at least double due to the growth of gaming as a whole. So what happens? And what would need to happen to MMOs for us to go through another time period where MMORPGs are the hype genre again?
What would it take to get more people hyped on making MMOs again? This may be completely wrong, but I think one thing that could potentially trigger a wave of new MMOs, but not necessarily massive multi-$100 million MMOs, is if you see all of the developers that have been leaving some of the bigger studios like Blizzard, etc. If they start smaller studios and they decide that they're more focused on making something that's profitable than they are denting the universe and trying to get every subscriber. And I think it is possible for people that have experience in the industry that feel that they can make a viable MMO to a smaller niche of people, but make a profitable MMO. I think we may see that more and more small to medium-sized companies with experience will take a crack at making smaller MMOs. Because if you look at it, EverQuest in 2002 with 450,000 subscribers, when people didn't have 3D cards and barely had computers and barely knew how to use email when they were like petitioning us with customer service issues, 450,000 subscribers back then, you know, that was like a cool 5-6 million, right, a month, which if you got a team of, you know, 30, 40 people and you're able to get half of that, that's not a bad month. That's not a bad month, right? So 225,000 subscribers. That's something that we're looking to do. I think there are going to be a lot of other smaller to medium-sized teams that look to do that, people with experience. And then, as Ulthrin just said, someone said 10,000 people would be enough to run a stable game. Again, depending on what your payback window is looking like and what your operating expenses are month to month, it's enough to sustain a small team. And then the question is, can you continue to make that game better and try to grow that from 10,000 to 15,000 to 30,000 people over the course of a couple of years? Those of you that are new here, the last company I worked at started like 10 years ago, and it's an online horse adventure game for girls. They started with like an 11-person team 10 years ago, had linear growth year over year for 10 years, and grew that to 700,000 monthly active users. So it's feasible.
I completely disagree with the idea that kids these days can't sit down and grind in a video game anymore. Because the fact is that whenever those same fucking boomers that are 43 now...
A boomer's 43. I'm so old. I wish we could get another term. We're all lumped into the boomer category. There's not a term for Gen X. That's such bullshit. But I am definitely a boomer.
Said that about us whenever we were in high school and we wanted to play WoW instead of EverQuest or Ultima Online. And now we're saying it about the kids nowadays that are playing Fortnite.
But he's true. I absolutely agree with him on this.
So I don't think it's that simple.
Dragon said, I don't think there will be a massive true resurgence. Sadly, companies have found more profitable routes to make money. I think there will be a renaissance of cool niche MMOs like M&M. You may be 100% correct on that. What I've found, though, is if a small team makes a decent amount of money, big companies will try to figure out how to do that same thing with the hopes of potentially making it bigger. And what I mean by that is Valheim came out. Valheim's a small team. They did extremely well with that. And how many companies, bigger companies, immediately, like Valheim, what, 3-person team, 5-person team? When you add in like the additional artists and stuff, I guess, that they, or additional people they got on, but they were like originally a 3-person team. Well, originally 2, plus publisher. As soon as Valheim was successful, how many other companies were like, oh, we should make something like Valheim, right? I mean, I've seen it in companies. The second somebody makes something that's successful, if they're a smaller team, bigger companies will go, oh shit, we should be doing that thing. Now, will they be successful? Maybe not. But big companies could just as easily, if not more easily, attack niche audiences than we can. They can actually throw resources at it. We've spent like 20 grand in the last 2 years and volunteered our time, right? G Fuel said, I have no experience in game dev, but a lot of cloud computing, things like that. Does the rise of platforms like AWS make it easier to scale a game to a larger audience with smaller dev team and thus lower expenses? Yeah. Having stuff like AWS available, having engines like Unity and Unreal and Godot and other stuff available is also makes it a lot easier. And then depending on how much you're trying to reinvent the wheel and do something completely new, that also is a factor.
Oh, is there all the MMOs that are dying? Oh no. Wow.
Maybe you get your old gaming group back together for launch, book some time off work, and within a week or two the cracks have already started to show and the game's bleeding players.
Speaking of this, I actually am curious to see if TheLazyPeon will do a video following up on some of the changes that have been made to New World. Because I do think that it's a very substantial development that the game has been growing. I consider that a tremendous development. It's actually one of the first times, like when was the last time that really happened with an MMO? Like Final Fantasy? I can't think of any other game. Maybe WoW, like after they made some changes in like 9.25, but we don't have any data for that. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. The number of MMOs that have been around for, I don't know, 10 plus years, I'm curious how many of them went through sort of maybe not as obvious a cycle of like launch and you kind of you fail to meet certain expectations or whatever, and then you start to ride out the long tail. I wonder how many of them were able to, just through like support of the company and kind of a continued investment in improving the game, were able to get to a point where they were able to either sort of sustain and grow and wind up with like, you know, a fairly profitable business unit. Because what people forget is even if, you know, you start out with tens of millions and it drops down to, you know, $1 million or 2 million or whatever it is, depending on the initial invest in it, it's possible, and you can make those numbers smaller or bigger or whatever, it's possible to hit a point where even if the original expectations aren't met, you actually do hit the payback window, then cover operating expenses and actually have a pretty profitable little product that's, you know, chugging along. And if it's continuing to maintain that level of profitability pretty consistently over years, that's no joke. Like having decent profit coming in this day and age, even if it's something that's lost the hype or isn't as sexy anymore or whatever, having that profit come in, I've seen, you know, firsthand at companies where it's like companies are kind of counting on that. I mean, look at EverQuest. EverQuest paid for a lot of other games to be developed, and those other games launched, and most of those other games were nowhere near as profitable as EverQuest, or if they were, it took quite a while. And so that's, even if the company starts to kind of ignore that game or whatever, if they're still giving it support and not canceling it, companies wind up with a nice little profit engine sitting back there. And then they're still rolling the dice on new games, and the new games may not even ever ship, or they may ship and fail as well. So yeah, I'm very curious about that. I'm very curious to see what happens with New World and sort of follow its trajectory.
New MMO releases nowadays almost never see a growing player base after launch.
Nope.
It felt like MMOs during this time period did a much better job at retaining players and even gaining players.
I don't agree with that point. If you go back and look at all of the MMOs that were discussed earlier in this video in terms of that bandwagon jumping period where like everybody was making an MMO, I would say statistically it would have to be more than half, if not the majority of them, came out, had hype, and then tapered off and either got canceled pretty quickly, lasted for a couple of years and died. Look at games like Earth and Beyond and all the other stuff that was coming out during that period. More MMOs have crashed and burned than have succeeded, but there were a handful of games that did a very good job of retaining players. And again, saw that firsthand. While working on EQ, every new MMO that came out, we would see our concurrent user count go down for a little bit. We would see other people go try that game out for a little bit, and then they would come back, a couple of months later, up until WoW.
Are people just fundamentally bored of the MMO formula? Why do so many games feel empty and repetitive? What's happened to us, and how has game design changed in the last 20 years? Well, for one, we have changed.
I think that's the big difference, is people are looking back at a time whenever they were more naive and they couldn't see the wizard behind the machine. I've said this 100 times, right? It's like people are nostalgic for being a young, naive kid more than they are nostalgic for any specific game.
I mean, he has said that a number of times. I think Josh Hayes has done a good job of articulating thoughts on this front as well. It may be true. It could be that it's impossible for folks to recapture that feeling. And I mean, we'll see. We're here to test that out a little bit, but hopefully also get new people in for the first time. But the thought is that even with that in mind, there is a different type of experience that could be made, and it's definitely worth a try. Veluxton said, after playing MMOs for years, I personally decided to stop due to the fact I couldn't compete with full-time gamers. The folks that have 14, 16 hours. The question I always have for people is, the folks that are like, oh, I can't compete, so I'll just stop. Maybe there's a happy medium, except the fact that you can't compete. But is there a layer of people that you would want to be around within these games? Do you enjoy the sense of place, or do you just, if you're not, is it one of those things where it's like a Ricky Bobby moment? If you're not winning, you're losing, and you gotta like bail. I think it just depends on the personality type. I've known a ton of people that never saw a max level, never rated, and still loved having years worth of experiences in games.
By the time a new MMO has fully released, we're ready to min-max the ever-living shit out of it.
Of course.
Less people played games that way back in the day. Do you remember being excited to get your first pair of shoulders back in vanilla WoW?
Yes.
They looked like a rug at best and gave you nothing but armor.
Bro, we were so stupid about min-maxing. Like, my guild, we made our Shadow Priest use Atiesh all the way through Burning Crusade, and nobody would give him an upgrade until the staff from fucking Illidan dropped.
So I agree with Asmon on this as well. If you look at my guild in EverQuest, right? Like I was never that hardcore. I was mainly there because my guild leader knew that I was part of the dev team. The guy that got me in the guild was part of the dev team as well, and so. But if we look at just how hardcore min-maxing that guild was, we were on a smaller server. We were on 7th Hammer, but my guild leader was so min-max spreadsheet theory craft crazy that even though we were the #1 guild on a smaller server, he was able to win the game wide best of the best as Shadow Knight, just because he knew everything about. Everything about the game, and we weren't giving him, spoilers or hints. We might give a nudge every once in a while, but yeah. So anyway, I disagree. The idea that folks are more min-max focused these days. I think what's happened is that there's a much larger total addressable market, so it's even easier for content creators and companies and everybody else to look at that top 10% or 15% or 3%, which is still a massive segment of players within these huge player bases. And so I think it's just become more, it's more visible. We're more aware of it. It's gone from FOH and, Legacy of Steel's homepages to just all over the place on the internet. And so you can't miss it. And I think the games have also facilitated it more and more. So if you look at like current WoW, if you look at live, I just think it's made it easier for this to be something where you have to min-max to actually sort of be a standard player. But my guild leader not only min-maxed like everything about equipment, my guild leader kept a spreadsheet of all the gear on the server so that he could actually facilitate drama within the second and third biggest guilds on the server, so that he could recruit people, so that he could cock block different spawns appropriately because he knew what the other guild's gearing was looking like. And he even min-maxed real life. If if our clerics had shitty video cards, he would actually buy them video cards. And you know what I mean? Like it was that kind of thing. So yeah, it was pretty hardcore, even in the early 2000s.
2007. So we were min-maxing this shit at the very beginning. So I think that there's a lot of people, again, this is what I was saying before, is that they didn't know anything about the game. They were fucking garbage. So I was garbage. There was a massive amount of people out there who min-maxed back then. It's just that the community was a lot smaller and many people were not part of it back then. There wasn't the internet sharing all the information.
Exactly.
Compared to older games, modern MMOs typically have
DC
a much
Universe
more
Online.
casualized open world and overall experience, to the point where going out and exploring doesn't feel dangerous. Unless you're inside a raid or doing some instanced challenge mode content, monsters in the world are usually trivial.
I think that they were always trivial for the most part. It's just that people were fucking garbage.
I wish there was a more polite way for me to articulate the fact that his point stands, but I do think that one thing that happens when you become really, really good at games, I've noticed this over the years. I think people, when they become very good at games, forget that they're in the top percentage bracket of people that play that game. Again, like I said before, there's still a whole 90% of a player base or 85% of the player base or 80% of the player base that the game actually is still dangerous when you go running around out there. Now, for some games, that may not be the case, but I like Peon's point on this, where he says, in some of these old games, it was just scary to run around. Oh, there's somebody right there in Asmon's chat that said, not EQ. Yeah, you could legitimately die just running around the world in EQ. And that's something that there are specific game design decisions that are made as part of that facilitated that death. So,
in the pursuit of accessibility, MMOs have kinda lost their sense of accomplishment, during the leveling anyway. Also, is it me?
Agreed. 100%.
I think that the sense of accomplishment during leveling, let me think about that. What game did I feel accomplished whenever I hit max level on? I felt pretty good whenever I got 60 in Lost Ark. Yeah, I felt pretty good about that, but it was more or less like just a box to check off. New World, I didn't really give a shit, because I had already hit 60 twice before then whenever the game came out, because I got on beta and the preview. And yeah, I'm trying to think, like, the last time I really felt good about getting max level. Maybe Classic WoW?
Did older MMOs just feel bigger? Larger worlds, longer time to get to max level, more races, professions, dungeons, mob types, and quest lines? Have developers put less effort into making their MMOs ambitious due to so many failing over the years?
It's interesting because those things they're very separate. And, in my opinion, the creating a sense of scale, having the diversity of classes and races and, that danger in the overworld, all of those things, they don't have to require a massive investment, but they do if you're trying to do all of that at an extremely high level of fidelity.
Games are made as a product nowadays more so than ever. Data analysis are at the forefront with market and consumer.
I think that games are always made as a product. Like, all those companies that were making MMORPGs in 2003 were doing it to make money. They were doing it because EverQuest was making money. Ultima Online was making money. This has always been the case.
I agree, but I would say that the reason why EverQuest and Ultima still have followings today, whereas a lot of those games from 2003 are nowhere to be found, is I think because back then, I moved to California and joined the company just because it was fucking cool. Like, it was just the coolest thing I'd ever witnessed. My mind was blown. We had people that moved to California like it was a pilgrimage. We had people that worked at the company in customer service that slept in tents, like full time, slept in tents in people's backyards because they were just that excited about being a part of the situation. It's a different era, but I don't know that has to be lost, right? Like, you've just got to find people that are passionate about making a specific thing and see what happens. We still see it with games that kind of like shock us. For as much as people might dismiss these things, I honestly feel like when you saw the pivot with, when you saw the pivot that took Fortnite from being like a survival builder game to battle royale or whatever, I don't believe they are expecting their success and then sort of shifting the dynamic in terms of every company wanting to make a battle royale. If you look at something that I think is more relevant, like if you look at Fall Guys, if you look at Valheim, these things still happen pretty regularly.
Maximize player engagement and profit. Most MMOs from 1999 to 2012 used a subscription fee business model with no cash shop.
Yeah.
This incentivized developers to make the game as good as possible, constantly pumping out updates to keep people handing over money every month because they enjoy the game. This was fine until some developers realized they could take a different approach and see much larger profits.
So that's a huge point. I don't think this point could be overstated. This is where a lot of the shift happened. And so subscriptions will come up more. I don't know if it'll come up more right here or it'll come up later or whatever. It's not greed. It's just maximizing value and not necessarily thinking about the implication. And again, I think there's nothing wrong with cash ops and free-to-play games and everything else. If people don't like it, then they won't be there. They won't make money. Some people like that. It's not for us. I believe firmly in subscription for the points that LazyPeon just made here. When you've got a subscription-based game, you've got a relationship with your customers that's so different. It's a situation where we want to make the coolest shit possible with the most longevity as possible. And we want to do that because we want you to keep coming back, because your lifetime value is dependent on how many months you pay us, right? So Metal Storm says, I wonder if sub-based MMO will work nowadays. I wonder if people would actually like it more as a fresh start. There are sub-based MMOs that are out there. There are sub-based hybrids, right? Like, so sub plus cash op. Sub-based totally works. There are companies out there like, basically companies making games that you've never heard of that are still making, $1 million, €1.5 million, €2 million or dollars a month off of subscription. When people talk about, like, I wonder about whether or not sub-based services are valid, more and more companies are moving subscription-based. People are indicating that they'll pay subscriptions, right? They may not pay a subscription for CNN Plus. It's funny, look at this, like a massive company like CNN was targeting, and I bring these up because, like, you've got to get a perspective on success. For CNN, they thought getting to the point where they have 2 million subscribers in their first year would be successful. And they had like 10,000 subscribers. So when a game that's out there, that's a smaller game, has got 500,000 subscribers, that's 5x what CNN could pull off with their subscription service, right? If you just boil it down to content is content. And if you look at companies in their early years, if you look at Hulu, if you look at Spotify, if you look at Disney Plus, all of that stuff, they had a couple of years where they're ramping to the point where they are now. Now, these companies have 200 million subscribers, but you've also got to look at their total addressable market is massive relative to a game. So if a game's got 200,000 subscribers, that's not bad. This idea that every game's got to get 12 million, 20 million subscribers is just ridiculous. It's just crazyville. And that's where a big part of the problem is. James ATL said, the problem with subscription MMOs now is I pay 3 video streaming services, a sports news site, Xbox Game Pass. Subscribing to a single MMO doesn't make sense to me on my budget anymore. I think that's completely valid if it doesn't make sense to you. But I think there are other people out there that would be like, all right, I can either pay for these 3 different video streaming services, or I can drop one and I can get just as much, if not more, content out of playing an MMO while watching the streaming service on my other monitor, especially if it's a slow-paced game like ours. And that's a personal budget decision that you have to make. But you've already indicated that you're willing to pay like 5 or 6 different streaming services. So then it becomes more of it's a competition for who's providing the most value. We're all competing for your time. Even shit that's not charging you money is competing for your time. If you want to spend 3 hours a day in the evening scrolling through Instagram instead of playing an MMO, that is your prerogative. But there are other people that would be like, screw it, I'd rather pay for an MMO.
Sub-fee MMOs, players are more likely to persist with difficulty because they've already paid the money and have committed to invest time into that game. Once a player is sufficiently invested into a free-to-play MMO, you can start to introduce the little annoying systems or inconvenience them in some way.
Yeah, I got the. I remember in Black Desert, I got to level 50, and then I looked on the store, and they had like this armor set that looked 1,000 times cooler than anything that I had looted, and it was like $15, and it gave me 10% more experience, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna buy this. And it was like, I did that a few times, and I was like, this is dumb, I'm not going to play this anymore.
This is why games like Lost Ark have such arbitrary leveling experiences. It's simply to create a cheap feeling of investment so that players are more likely to spend money on the cash shop later on.
Any game that has pay for convenience just incentivized inconvenience. Because now, they make money whenever the game's inconvenient. Yeah, Phaons in Lost Ark. Like, why is this in the game? No other game fucking needs this.
I mean,
why
I've
do
been
we
there.
need this?
It's almost always, it's designed in. It's part of the design doc. And it's not considered like, I don't know if the teams think of it in this way. I kind of go back and forth. I'm sure that we've been guilty of it in the past on something. But I do see that... I have seen where it's basically built into the design doc, and it's not meant as like, oh, we're building an inconvenience. We're building in a motivational driver. I don't know how we rationalize this shit behind the scenes sometimes. I honestly don't. But and it's obvious. It's obvious what's going on there. So again, that is why I'm so happy to just make games that are subscription based. Oh, it's an interesting question. Do devs know that submodels are a massive gatekeeper? Gatekeeping, this term that's become, and I'm gonna do something that's bad. It's a generalization, it's a characterization, but there are a lot of like terms that since the advent of like, since people moved from like Tumblr to Twitter, and Twitter became more and more of a thing that some people give a shit about for some reason. I don't know why. There are a lot of these terms that get used, like gatekeeping, right? And I put it up there with like, that's cringe and that's a bad look. There's this interesting thing with gatekeeping. Gasoline is a gatekeeper for making your car work. My landlord is a gatekeeper. They gave me the key to go in the apartment. If I stop paying, then they're going to gatekeep my ass out of the apartment. Do devs know that submodels are a massive gatekeeper? They are a barrier to entry, to use the older term for it, for some people. But in exchange for a barrier to entry, and this is sort of a big theme in this video, we're able to provide a better relationship, we believe, with the customer that's then a more honest relationship over time. So Mr. Evil Rex said, when I use Gatekeeper, I mean, when I buy WoW, I have to sub to play the game again. Whereas New World, I can just hop back in and do what I want. I do not lose the value that I've already paid into the game. Yes, because that is the service. That's the service. Like if I pay Netflix for a year and watch a bunch of shows and movies, if I cancel Netflix, they don't let me rewatch the shows that I've already watched, if that makes sense. And I invested my time in watching those, just like I would invest my time in my character to progress it. Metalstorm said, I guess with Netflix versus games, with games you have created something and accumulated something of worth. In Netflix, there's nothing like that. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to time investment. Ultimately, sort of whether folks like it or not. The entertainment in that time that you've invested is basically owned by the company that provides the service. Wouldn't DLC model be best like Destiny, or would that not be enough to fund development? The answer to that depends, I think, on scale. DLC, like basically putting a game out and having it either be free or having an initial box sale that it then leads to a free game that is then supported through DLC release. It works at a certain scale, but if you don't hit that scale, then it won't be enough to fund development. I think the games as a service subscription model makes it easier for smaller teams or medium-sized teams to operate at a much smaller scale, but still be able to cover their operating expenses and grow. Monty said, Destiny has a complicated business model. They have a lot of layers to it, not just new expansion. They also have season passes, etc. Yeah, and I wouldn't be shocked if companies that started with one model have over time switched to like Battle Pass or Game Pass and things of that nature.
As the old sub-fee MMOs, the developers are incentivized to give players the best game possible to keep them subscribed. For me, this is the biggest reason why MMOs from 1999 to 2012 just felt different. The business model just allowed these games to attempt to be the best versions of themselves.
Yeah,
Agreed.
Whilst modern MMO monetization sounds greedy and malicious.
And here's the thing, I'm not going to lie to you on this. This isn't me blowing smoke up your ass. When I was on the EQ team, when we were working on DCUO, you know, I've been on teams where the team just wanted to make the best fucking game possible. That was it. That was it. We had so much pride in being on those teams. We had so much pride, especially those of us that were EQ fans that became the EQ team over time. We had so much love and pride, so much love for that game and so much pride in being able to be a part of making that game and being a part of the community and stuff. We just wanted to make the best game possible. And we knew that if we made the best game possible, we would be rewarded with subscribers, with retention of subscribers, with money. And we got, I've never been better compensated in terms of bonuses and stuff like that than those first years in the industry on EverQuest. We just wanted to make the coolest game possible. And we were so critical of each other. And there was so much conflict between like the design team and the art team and programmers. Like there was so much like constant conflict to just kind of like push each other and make better, cooler shit. Chrono Zero said, I think that really came through in the EQ interviews. Yeah, if you don't know, check it out. I just linked it. Got like 60 hours worth of interviews with like former EQ folks. Dude, we just wanted to make the coolest fucking game. That was it. Because that's a huge point of pride. That's it, man. And I think so many developers out there really do want to do that. It's just, does the company let them do it? Or is the company pushing the KPIs? You know, are they trying to, you know, we hear what you're saying, guys, but we've got to focus test this so that we can try to, you know, maximize the KPIs with a certain user segment. And can't you just, we're going to need you to build this system and we're going to need you to move to free to play. Like, no, man. Yeah. So this point that was just made here about back in the day, there was a different vibe. I think that's true. I'm not trying to shit on any people that are working on free to play games or anything else. I've done it as well, but I do think there's probably a lot of people out there that agree with me.
It's bloody expensive to make an MMORPG, more so than any other genre of game.
Oh,
Some
absolutely.
MMOs have taken.
And so this is where there's a bit of like, there's some stumbling that happens here, I think, because now we get back to what I mentioned at the very beginning of like watching this, which is in order to make an MMO, you have to spend $200 million. You have to spend $400 million. And what that is that's framing what the content creators believe an MMO is. In order to make the next big thing, in order to make the thing that supplants WoW in the history books, you have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. In the second companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm sorry, yeah, they're not going to take these risks. And they're not going to make, they're not going to make a niche game of any sort. They're not going to, until, I mean, with inflation, I don't know, maybe $200 million is essentially last week's, $2 million. So maybe I'll be a liar in 2 weeks. But for the time being, the second we start thinking that the game that we will consider a true MMO, 50 million, 100 million, 200 million or whatever, then okay, sure. Yeah, then this basically takes us back into the problem space.
7 to 9 years of development time to make and costs close to $200 million.
Because the thing is, you can make a game with over time a couple $1 million that generates hundreds of millions of dollars, right? It's just true. And a lot of companies, I think a lot of companies don't necessarily look at it that way. Investors don't look at it that way. But the companies that do, going back to my earlier ramble about medium-sized companies thinking about it and going, oh shit, I used to work on EQ, or I used to work on WoW, or I used to work at this company. Man, remember when we were making like $6 million a month back in the early 2000s off a relatively, small player base by today's standards? Yeah, $6 million a month's not bad. Let's try to shoot for that. Like, you know what I mean? So let's shoot for half of that. We've got a small company. It wouldn't be bad to make $1 million a month, $2 million a month, right? And that's just taking that 450,000 subs and cutting it in half again. It's feasible. It's feasible. Again, I'm not saying this because I'm going to be like, yeah, we're absolutely going to nail this and we're not going to have any challenges or we're guaranteed to do that with M&M. We don't know. We've got to make a game. Everybody has to make a game. Whether you're spending 200 million or, 2,000, you've got to make the game. And so our focus is on making the game. But the belief is if we make the game and we hit what we want, you know, if we achieve what we're trying to achieve, we could see a small game that's got enough to get us going, to get us all paid, to potentially exceed that, to be profitable, to allow us to reinvest smartly in the business, to grow the team in a smart way, to grow the player base because it's something unique and people are like, oh shit, man, yeah, I gave it a try and this is actually pretty good, right? And because that's how people got into the earlier games. We don't need to spend 20 million on marketing that we've then got to pay back, right? So yeah, it's crazy. We've got to reframe this.
Think about it. Why would you invest 50 to 100 mil over 7 years to make an MMO that may or may not be successful when you could invest less than 1 mil to make a mobile game that will probably see you 10x your investment within 2 years?
But it's interesting because in theory, you can make a smaller MMO or you can make a smaller game that's not mobile and still potentially 10x your investment over the course of 2 years. Metalstorm said it'd be interesting to see a poll of what people would pay for a sub. We've run them in the past. Most people hit like the $10 or $15 mark. I think 15 because it's just sort of common. For a smaller game, people tend to say they'd rather pay like $9-10. What we're thinking with our subscription is have it be like maybe in the $10 range with a tip jar and with our merch. And so the idea would be you can pay us whatever you want above $10, but it's then like $10, right? So yeah, something along those lines. And then we want to sell the shit out of merch just because we love merch. Correct. Tip. Nothing extra in game. We will not sell anything in game. And then merch is all out of game. If you want to give us a tip, that's great. Maybe we'll have like something on the website or whatever, thanking you for it or whatever, put you in the credits. I don't know. We're not going to give you a title. We're not going to give you a hat. We're not going to give you a mount. We're not going to make you glow. Yeah. Above 10 would be too much for a lot of people. Yeah. I mean, it feels like a decent amount, right? No $40 character skins. No Vagrant. No.
This as an example, actually. That's a really good fucking transition. So yeah, look at Diablo Immortal. Diablo Immortal was like no fucking, there was no real investment of money that Blizzard put into that game compared to how much money they're making out of it. Like, look at how much, I mean, I guarantee you it took a lot more fucking effort to make Diablo 3 than Diablo Immortal. But just think about that. Boo.
You guys want have phone?
Unfortunately, as gaming monetization has changed, the risk versus reward just isn't there for MMO investment nowadays like it used to be back when it was the hype genre. So is there any hope? Will we ever see MMOs become the hype bandwagon genre again? Is the fantasy of what's portrayed?
One thing that's really cool though is like throughout this video is to actually see background footage of stuff that I've worked on. That makes me feel nice.
Trade in Sword Art Online, Ready Player One, or Overlord a real possibility in the future?
I think that the success of things like Ready Player One, Sword Art Online, Overlord, and, you know, like other things that are related to that, I think that it indicates that people like the aesthetic of it. They like the ideal of it. It's just that there's no game that really can create that type of a real-life experience. You see what I'm saying? Like, there are many times where, you know, like a show like that is extremely popular and everybody likes it, but it's just not, like, nobody can create that in real life yet.
I saw an article that was basically talking about a job in the future will be acting as an NPC. I know it sounds pretty dystopian and crazy, but I could picture once people are all jacked into VR in this experience that they keep talking about sort of being the thing in the future that will be the revitalization of that feel that we all had in the early days. I could see where people basically earn the money to pay for their microtransactions in their virtual world through being actors in other contexts. It could wind up being very dystopian. Keep said people act as NPCs now and get paid to do it on NoPixel. See, Keeps, I've just been behind in my current events. I've been saying this for 20 years and it wasn't even an original thought. I read it in I think a Tad Williams book, Elseworld or something like that. Yeah, it's acting. We do want to have that be a potential job at some point in the future of our company. We definitely want to be able to pay people to be badass NPCs. Just like GMs used to run events back in the day.
We're surely going to reach the point with AI and technology that MMOs just become easier and easier to make. Unreal Engine
Yeah.
5 has made significant improvements to the development pipeline
That's a
of
good thing.
games. There's a worry that AI-generated art is going to ruin the art industry.
Bruh.
And computers are still becoming more powerful every year. Perhaps one day in the future we can just tell AI what we want in a game, and it will be able to do hundreds of hours of artwork, asset design and coding within a few minutes.
That's smart. I like
Vastly reducing the amount of time it takes to actually make an MMO, the costs associated with it, and as a result improving the risk versus reward of such a venture for investors.
So yeah, what is it, GDP3? Like the crazy chatbots that are out there. I do think, and if the tech, so if tech, like it is GDP3, right? GDP3, GDP4. I think that as those types of chatbots and that type of AI gets better, I would love to, somewhere down the line, if it happens in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, I would absolutely, it's on my list of things to do, to have us bring up a server that's just basically all of the NPCs are essentially using GDP, whatever, 7 at the time or something, and see how much of an experience we could create. But I do think that there's a good point here with regards to, because I look at AI generation of content of any sort is essentially tool. I do think we'll continue to see these tools improve. And so then it's going to go back down to how do we make something that is compelling for the right niche. And we're also asked, don't think there needs to be, or said, think there needs to be AI VR. People still love old stuff like P9. I agree. I think every time that's said here, it's just meant to say the next big thing, not necessarily the next viable thing.
I think that's a big factor.
Will do,
It's
Monty.
like having things that are procedurally generated or to some degree generated more quickly than they can be min-maxed, I think is super important. I do think that if people had the option to play a game with and without monetization, people would probably choose the game without monetization. I think that also, like, even if they wouldn't choose it at the beginning, they would probably come around to it. As games with monetization, they run their course more quickly. So if you reduce the amount of cost to, like, enter into the market, then it's easier for somebody to enter into the market without a game that's hyper monetized.
And that's basically what we've been saying. Now, I don't know that he's thinking of these smaller niche MMOs that we've been discussing as the examples. And when he says without monetization, I don't know that explicitly or I don't know that is he's implying subscription based. But let's just assume instead of microtrans, he's saying subscription based. And then he's saying when you reduce the cost of getting into the market, then you don't have to be crazy hyper monetized in order to have enough success to drive forward, right? To be able to then grind and grow. That point that he just made in the last like 10 seconds is very much what we've been talking about for the last 2 years, right?
I want to see the next big MMO bring back that sense of awe you had when you saw a player on the server with some crazy legendary item that nobody else has.
I think that the reason why it's hard to have that level of awe for me, I am very good at breaking down processes. And the majority of the processes that you have to go through to obtain items like this are not a test of skill. It is a test of logistics, time, and investment. That's really what it is.
Definitely agree. But I also think this goes back to that sort of, and there's nothing wrong with it, but he's speaking from the point of view of someone that plays games in that manner. And that's not everybody. And so then the question becomes, can there be games out there that are created in a way that they enhance their appeal to the people that don't necessarily want to just deconstruct it and min-max it? So yeah, I really, really enjoyed watching that yesterday. Yeah, so I have all these tabs back here to basically prove a case that I don't think needs to be made, but it's so interesting to see like some of these numbers, right? Like total player counts in millions. 2017 Roblox, it was 45 million, and now they're at what is that 1.9 billion for the year? That had to be more than that. Is it really only 1.9 billion? Going back down to the player count. Average daily players of Roblox in the last 30 days, 20 million. They have 22 million players daily. Yeah, because I was about to say, I could have sworn they were at like 200 million. And if you just look at it, like you go through the various games and services, there's a lot out there. No wonder they don't improve Roblox. They have their money. Do they not really improve it? It seems like it's been improving, and they've got a pretty robust ecosystem of people making content within it. Yeah, so I mean, Roblox has got ridiculous numbers of players. Minecraft's got a ridiculous number of players. Yeah, there's all sorts of. I mean, Genshin Impact doesn't get discussed very much, but they're still making like 150, 200 million a month, maybe 250 million a month, something like that.